Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the commemoration of the Attica riots. The Attica is all of us. Opportunity to hear from our brothers, from the lawyers, from people who were there that evening. Yes, we know that this is an important evening, the 50th year anniversary of those riots. So we know that it was one of the most important evenings when you start speaking about prison uprising. It was the bloodiest in U.S. history. And it's one of the most known and most significant flashpoints in prisoners' rights. A revolt in our history. Prisoners demanding on guess what date? September 9th, 1971. But wait, can we have a moment of silence for those individuals who lost their life on that evening? A moment of silence, please. Thank you. We have to remember where we came from in order to move it forward. So we want to make sure that we also say thank you to Manhattan Neighborhood Network, also to Alliance of Families for Justice, for supporting families and empowering individuals and helping us learn, standing with our brothers and standing with them as our ancestors as we push forward for individuals to be able to have some of the things that they have in incarceration today. But we know that across the nation, we still have quite a bit of work to do. So today we're going to have two panels, first led by our sister, Soffiyeah Elijah, the Executive Director of Alliance of Families for Justice. Yes, supporting families, empowering families, educating families, mobilizing families so that they can do the work for themselves, marshaling over them, making sure that they understand and are able to get out and have voting power. Yes, the Alliance is doing a lot of work and they brought us here this evening. And Soffiyeah is going to lead our first panel with our brothers as we find out what legacy are we standing on. Give it up for our godmother. She's also the leader of the women who are on this march. We always go to her as the godmother to make sure that we're on the road and make sure we have a clear vision to freedom. She'll be leading them in tonight. Soffiyeah?
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to moderate this roundtable discussion. Thank you so much for giving me the honor to moderate this panel with you all. It's really important that our audience has a chance to learn a bit about the history and the legacy of Attica. So my first question is going to be to you, Che, to please describe the conditions in Attica in leading up to September 9th, 1971.
The conditions at Attica were horrible. I'll begin by saying that the food, as an example, was lousy. Pork every day, the same food every day. That was one condition. The other condition was that we got showers once a week and toilet paper once a month. That was another condition. Other conditions were the medical situation. Whenever we went to see these two Nazis at the infirmary, they will give us aspirins, regardless of what illness you had an aspirin, and they would never have no contact with you. It was through a little screen. So that was another condition. The Black Muslims, as an example, they wasn't allowed to have religious services in the yard. The Hispanic population, as an example also, was the mail, when it was received, if it was written in Spanish, it was ripped up. Why was it ripped up? Because there was nobody there to read Spanish. And so they would rip up the letters. Most of the Hispanic families that came up to visit their loved ones, if they didn't speak English, they were in trouble. They were not allowed into the prison. So those were the conditions, that led up to rebellion. People was totally tired of these type of conditions, you know. And plus, they didn't treat us like human beings. They treated us like slaves. They treated us like we was nobody to them. You know, how far could you go, you know, with these type of conditions until you start rebellion? You know, just like, you know, when you put a dog up against a corner and you hitting them and you hitting them and you hitting them and you hitting them, eventually that dog is gonna bark you. It's gonna bark at you, regardless of how much that dog may love you. It's gonna bark at you. So it's the same with us. You know, we just couldn't tolerate the conditions any longer.
Okay, Shay, thank you. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. But I turn to Akil because I know that in order for people to really understand what took place on the 9th, they have to understand the layout of Attica because it's different from most of the other prisons. So Akil, would you do that for us? Would you explain to the audience how Attica was set up and still is set up for that matter?
Attica is like a big box with a cross in the middle of it. And each section inside that cross is a block, A block, B block, C block, and D block. These 4 blocks connected at a place called Times Square. And that's when everybody used to come through to either go to the mess hall or work programs or whatever they had to do. And you was confined to your block. The only time you was allowed to see if you had a father in another block, if you did see him coming out the mess hall, if he was at the last tail end of another block coming out, you may catch him. But on the 4th of July, they opened the doors for an hour and a half, and they let you switch over to different blocks. Other than that, that's it. You were confined to your block, and that's it.
So I'm going to turn to you, Latif. You had I guess we'll say the misfortune of having arrived at Attica just 30 days or so before the 9th and before everything took off. So what was your impression of Attica? What was the atmosphere as you would describe it, having gotten there just 30 days earlier?
It was totally suppressed and oppressed. You could feel that. It was so thick that, you know, you could actually cut that. And the only thing you could do is come out when they cracked your cell. That was either eating, sick call, or work, or visit, depending on those things. But other than that, you were sort of like totally in your cell. Rest. You'd come out for rest, you know, go out to the yard for whatever time rest was. It seems like to me, as soon as you got into it, it was time to lock up. But when I arrived at Attica, it was like the first thing and the first impression I seen was this 30-foot wall. And to me, I said, who's going there? They turned in there. So I said, well, it's us. So, real.
Okay. I've heard a number of people say that it was a very tense situation there. Was that your impression, that there was a lot of tension?
They talked to us horribly. They didn't care. They may call you the N-word just because. And I guess it was all according to your presentation. You know, a man is not going to be docile 24/7. You know, enough is enough. So pretty much what I did was just responded as courteously as I could. So I guess on that point, it kind of helped me get through. Other than that, it was just totally oppressive and suppressive.
Thank you, Latif. I'm going to shift to you, Eddie. You were in Attica in September of 1971 as well.
I arrived in November of 1970, so it was almost a year before the uprising. And when inmates go in, at least for the first time, they go through an orientation, and the assistant warden was there. I think his name was Fail. And so they tell you a bunch of stuff. But what really struck me, what really stood out, was he says to me, listen, if you're smart, you stay away from the blacks. And I'm like, what? And he said, if they want to hang out with you, it's always for the wrong reasons. They just want something from you. It's just going to be a problem. If you're smart, you stick to your own kind. And I'm sitting there going, you're not even subtle about your strategy of dividing up the inmates, but that's what they wanted to do. And I think what was really significant about what happened leading up to the uprising and during the uprising and after was that the inmates saw through that. They saw that in order to get anything done, we had to stick together. And we had to not buy into that division. And there were, you know, this was all happening within the political backdrop of what was going on in the country in the late 60s and in 1970. You know, you had a lot of political stuff going on, you know, against the war and within the civil rights movement. And you had, you know, these leading figures like Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and Angela Davis and so on. So there was a growing political awareness that was happening outside and a movement that was happening outside. And it also was taking place inside as us inmates were expanding our political understanding, our political awareness, in understanding how we had a common cause. And a lot of that was fed in organizing that went on inside prior to the uprising. And I'm not talking about organizing an uprising, because the uprising was spontaneous. That was not planned. There was a spark because of the tension that the other brothers have been talking about. It didn't take much to set it off, right? Mm-hmm. But what happened was the warden, Mancusi, was, I have a hard time avoiding any
Don't do it. Don't do it.
I won't do it. But that guy, he just as a showpiece, he set up a sociology class because there was an inmate in there that had taught at the university level sociology. So he says, I'm going to make it look good and create a sociology class. So think back about what Akil said. Attica was really 4 prisons, maybe 5, you know, but really 4 separate prisons that were divided. Well, with the sociology class, there was actually a classroom where inmates could come. It was within the school where they could actually gather. The school was primarily self-study. You know, you turn in a lesson and it comes back to you. And I was a teacher over there. So I would correct lessons.
Eddie.
Yeah.
I just want to pause you for a second so that everybody understands. When you say that people would come to the sociology class, are you saying that people from different blocks could intermingle in this class?
Yes.
Okay.
And the thing is, it was a sociology class, but what it quickly turned into was a place where brothers from different cell blocks and different organizations like the Young Lords Party, Black Muslims, Black Panthers, and guys like Sam Melville, who was a really significant figure before and during the uprising. He was murdered, you know, on the 13th. We were able to sit and talk and go, what are we going to do? How are we going to overcome this? And we were reaching out to people on the outside, like Assemblyman Arthur Eve, who was very open-minded and responsive, and like Reverend Scott in Rochester, and trying to communicate with these people to try to get some changes made. They weren't trying to start a revolution. They were trying to reform and make things better. And I think when the uprising took place, that helped things gel so that when hostages were taken, they said, okay, what are we going to do? Let's get together.
I don't want us to skip over George Jackson and his death, because that's a significant piece. Shay, do you want to speak to that?
Brother George, he was assassinated August 21st of 1971. During that time, we in Attica, the Young Lords and the Black Panthers and the Muslims, we were trying to figure out what we're going to do, you know, to commemorate brother, to pay our respects. And so we came up with what is called the hunger strike, where we organized the population very disciplinedly to participate, and many people participated. We walked into the mess hall and quietly, without even making no sound, you know, we sat down, and many of us, including myself, we had black armbands, and we waited for the guard to give us a signal so that we could move out. The brother's assassination was something that many of us could not accept. You know, the fact that he had a gun underneath his afro, that's ridiculous. You know, we knew that was a lie. The hunger strike was very successful, you know, and everybody participated. You know, blacks, whites, you know, Latinos, you know, we all came together on that, even though a lot of whites probably didn't even know who George Jackson was. But the mere fact that we were all there, you know, in the same conditions, many of them just got down and participated.
You just made a point. You said many people maybe didn't know who George Jackson was. It occurs to me some of our audience listening weren't born by 1971. So they may not know who you're referring to when you talk about George Jackson or where he was killed, because it wasn't in Attica. So could you just take a moment and explain that in a sentence or two so that we set the context?
Okay, briefly, let me just say that Brother George was arrested. I think he was 17 years old in California. He was accused of stealing, I think it was $70 or $75 from the gas
$10.
station, something like that. $10? Okay.
Yeah.
You know, and so he was incarcerated. At first he was at Soledad, you know, and I think that he went to the same channels that I went to, you know, to get politicized. Once he became politicized, he started organizing. And I think that's one of the reasons why they transferred him out from Soledad to St. Quentin.
I think we've kind of set the tone and the atmosphere of what was leading up to September 9th. And I'm going to start with Latif. Could you briefly describe what the morning of September 9th, how it unfolded for you?
That night, they put a key block on my door. That means, like I said, you either had some type of appointment, so it wouldn't be necessary for you to go to your assigned, you know, like duty, like from the mess hall to there. I remember all this commotion, and that was coming from A block. I was in C block. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it. I was in C block. I know I heard a lot of cussing from the ones that were still trying to sleep, but what happened is that I heard all this crashing and hollering and yelling and things like that. And I'm like, what's really going on? Somebody had mentioned the horn, and you know, they said the only time they ever heard that was the escape. I had never heard it because I just got there. And I'm saying, what in the world is going on? They gonna kill us or what? So I heard somebody say, go to the yard, follow everybody, go to the yard. If you don't, you know, if you try to stay behind, we're gonna do something to you, you know. And in prison, that meant do something to you. So I got with the crowd. Wherever the crowd went, I turned. When they turned, I turned. And then what I remember is that I seen a lot of sunshine, and that was the yard, and there was a lot of celebrants out there because, you know, they had taken control. So their first impulse and instinct was that they were gonna have some fun. And I'm still sort of like in awe because I'm saying this is kind of real serious. I've never experienced anything like this. Because in my gut was telling me they're gonna get on that wall, they're gonna shoot everybody. They held out because I think they said, well, we'll first try to negotiate.
And after you described the morning of the 9th, we didn't talk about the evening of the 8th.
There was a disturbance between an African-American and a white young man. But they were actually not in a scuffle. They took it for that. And I guess in trying to subdue both of them, they all ended up fighting. So they locked them up. And the guy went to the box, but those that observed it, I guess that was the straw that broke the camel's back because it didn't sit well with anybody. And, you know, you could hear the whispers when it got down. So, yeah, they say something's going to jump off in the morning when they pop those sails, and that's what happened.
Akil, if you want to add to that about what happened the evening of the 8th.
Yes, I do. I knew Leroy Dewar. In fact, he came home in Auburn. He came from Auburn. He was one of the Auburn people that was sent to Attica. He had an argument from what we understood, what we heard. He had an argument with a white guy. But the thing is that we knew the police didn't like black people. So we heard that he was screaming and hollering when they took him off to the box, but the white guy was walking. And people wanted to find out what happened to him. The next day when they came out, it broke in A block. All I remember on the 9th is my door being cracked. And the police wasn't doing the cracking of the doors. It was the inmates. And when I came out to D block yard, I was young, and the only thing on my mind was the same thing that was on my mind when Auburn happened, party time.
And I'm gonna turn to you, Che. Do you remember anything else that happened on the 8th?
The way it was told to me by some brothers of A block was that there was these two people, a white and a black, they were sparring. And so a guard came over and tried to break it up, and they couldn't. And so a lieutenant came over and he tried to break it up. And for some reason, one of the brother, he had his elbow moved back by accident and hit the lieutenant in the jaw. But the lieutenant did not do nothing at that moment. So that evening, when people got locked in for the night, that's when the goon squad, they went into the cells and did those two brothers in, and then took them out, and then took them to segregation. While they were passing, one Hispanic, he threw something at one of the guards, and they looked back at him, and then he said nothing. So the next day, they opened up the cells to let people, so that people could go to eat, breakfast. But they kept that Hispanic brother, they kept him locked up. And so somebody, as they were going out, came and opened it up, and that brother, Hispanic brother, he got out, and he went with 5 block. It was 5 block, 5th block. They went to breakfast, and so when they came back, it was time for them to have recreation, and for some reason they noticed that there wasn't no recreation involved. They were gone back to their cells. And so, people just said, no, man, we're going to have our recreation, and that's when everything just went off.
Che, we're back to you. Things have jumped off. At some point, you end up in the yard, right?
First of all, I was in B block. All of a sudden, I heard the siren go off. In Attica, when the siren goes off, most of the time it's because somebody escaped. Everybody in the metal shop stopped working. They started listening to the sound. Very loud sound, and so I started looking towards the door, and I saw on the other side, I saw Sam Melville. He was, bro. And they were banging on the door and banging. And I said, oh, shoot, man, what is that brother doing on the other side? But because I didn't know, then all of a sudden the door just gave in, and Brother Sam, he came in, he said, y'all are free. I looked at the brother, I said, yeah, brother, I'm free. I'm really going to be free when I'm out of here. But I said, okay, I go along with that. And so I started running. I don't know where Sam Melville, he probably went trying to free other people. but I was running with the crowd. As I got closer to the D yard, I noticed that there were some brothers that were coming. I'm not mentioning no names. Brothers were coming and had hostages, and I said, oh shit, what's happening here? This is something that I didn't even imagine, And so I walked into the yard and I saw everybody all over the place. People were doing all kinds of drinking and, doing all kinds of negative stuff.
So we have the initial scene in the yard. And then at a certain point, things start to get organized and there's a list of demands. Akil, is that something you can speak to?
We voted to have people represent us in the yard. They got law and order. The Muslims took over because everybody it was mayhem. We organized, we got together and we voted certain people to speak for us. And the Muslims took over securing the guards' safety. And everything started to get organized at that point. That was going on really the end of the first day towards the second day.
There were demands that were crafted and put out. Che, are you able to tell the audience what at least some of those demands were?
The restructuring of the parole board, as an example, because when people go to parole board, they actually don't have no representation whatsoever, and they pass these decisions based on their own concerns and not based on the interests of the inmates. And so that was one of the things. The other thing was the mail, better food, better treatment,
education,
education.
Mhm.
We were asking to be respected as human beings.
There you go.
Okay.
That's right.
Thank you, Che. Now
Mhm.
we're going to move forward to what happened on the 13th.
Well, several months before the uprising in the spring, I think, there were 5 inmates called the Attica Liberation Faction who created 27 demands. And I worked up in the school, so I had a desk and a typewriter. And I don't remember who, but somebody came to me and said, hey, can you type this up? So I actually typed up the demands slow and made carbon copies. And those were sent out to Oswald and different people on the outside.
And who was Oswald?
Oswald was, yeah, he was the, was it called superintendent?
Corrections.
He was the commissioner.
Yeah, he oversaw the entire prison system in New York State.
Okay.
And basically what happened was he came and he met, but he just paid lip service to it and nothing happened. And that was right before the uprising. Now, the demands that were drawn up and presented after the 9th weren't the same demands exactly, but most of the content, ironically, was the same stuff that he ignored before, but now they're hostages at stake.
Akil, I'm going to ask you, I know you specifically have some information to share about what happened in A-Yard, because we hear a lot about what happened in D-Yard, but let's talk about what happened in A-Yard briefly.
They had 8 of us in A block corridor, you know, as security. And that morning on the 13th, well, he's not here no more. Big Black came in with somebody else that was with him and they said, listen, you guys are in a hot spot. You know, we don't know how they're going to come, if they're going to shoot rubber bullets or real bullets. We don't know what's going on. Because I really thought they were shooting rubber bullets. We had a table on the floor with around 3 or 4 mattresses on it, you know, to dive down on. That day, when they left, we decided to stay up there. We said, no, we okay. You know, we stay up here, you know, because we wanted to stay together. We formed this like alliance with each other, and we just wanted to be with each other at the end. We didn't think it was going to be the end. But anyway, when they dropped that gas in the yard, the helicopter came above, and they started dropping gas. They were shooting gas down the corridor. When they opened the gate and started shooting, coming down the hallway, they was running. And I seen the guy jump up from the gas, because that gas was, man, you couldn't breathe. And the guy jumped up, and I saw blood gush out his neck. And the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, shit. I mean, you know, they really shooting real bullets. So I told my friend Taxi, I said, listen, Taxi, get down. I said, when we go out that door, don't go out first and don't go out last. Let's try to get between. And when we came out the door, I got hit. And when I fell on the floor outside an A block's yard, because that's where we was at, in A block's corridor, somebody fell on my foot, and I looked down because gas was starting to rise. It was Taxi. He was laying there, and then I heard the police come into the yard. And that's when they took me, told me I wasn't shot good enough, and they handcuffed me behind my back, ripped my clothes off me, and made me run up A block corridor to a cell in A block. And they left me in there for like a half an hour with a police or a guard sitting in front of the cell. And they said, if he tries to make a move, blow his brains out. So I sat there with my hands cupped behind my back on the toilet bowl. And when they came back, they said, they came back with around 3 or 4 police. They said, come on out. So they took me out, and I was walking across the yard to housing block Z at the time, the special housing unit now. And I saw them dumping bodies on an army truck. And I said to myself, this looked like a scene from the Twilight Zone.
Thank you. Since we have just a little bit of time left, what do you think is the most important takeaway in a sentence or 2?
The most important thing to me to take away was that I still believe I was going to get killed, like the brother was just talking about, because I too ran the gauntlet. And before I did that, LD pushed me down. We grew up together. You know, we were out in the streets together. And he said, man, get down. They're shooting. I was frozen. I couldn't do nothing. I couldn't believe it. So he pushed me down. And the next time I looked down, the guys were beating me and pulling my clothes off. He was bleeding. He said, go ahead, man. I'm going to be all right. We're naked. Mind you, we're butt naked in a cell of maybe 6, 7 guys. They'd give us paper to cover up with at night because they shot all the windows out. It's A block. You know, there's got to be a better system in this to treat human beings better, because, you know, they treated us as if, and I'm talking about white, black, Spanish, whatever, they treated us as if we were just, they treat cattle better than they did us. And I said, this got to change. So I began thinking about, you know, the court system, the legal system, the police system is saying that they all were in collusion together that created this type of warehouse and this type of atmosphere. And to this day, that's what I've been trying to put my energy in that particular, trying to see, we got to come up with a better legal system than this. That was my thought.
This whole system has to change. People have to realize that they have to vote to change these laws. They got to put people in office to change these laws. I don't think it's going to ever happen in my lifetime. If you want to do it with this system still here, you have to vote. You have to vote and put your votes in.
I thank all of you so much for sharing some of those experiences. And I hope that our audience will go to the website for atticaisallofus.org, where they can see longer interviews with each of you, where you got to share a lot more of the history, because it's so very important. And I hope that our audience won't, if they say, don't turn that dial, stay tuned and continue to learn.
We're going to continue the conversation that started in that first panel from the perspective of some of the various participants that were part of the resistance and the fight back to the conditions that gave rise to this uprising. So first, let me ask Brother James Brown to introduce himself.
Okay, my name is James Brown, and I was up in Attica during the uprising slightly before. I was transferred from Auburn as a result of a uprising there, and that's how I wound up in Attica.
Now let's hear from Reverend Scott.
My name is Minister Raymond Scott. I was president of the Fight Organization in Rochester, New York, when this happened. And the people that had loved ones there came over to our organization and asked us to help and find out what the situation was like there and that their loved ones were safe.
And finally, we have Attorney Michael Deutsch.
My name is Michael Deutsch. I'm an attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago, and I was one of the organizers of the Attica Brothers Legal Defense. And 20 years later, I was one of class counsel that brought the civil rights suit on behalf of the victims of the state police and prison guards massacre.
James, when you introduced yourself, you told us that you were a transfer from Auburn. What happened at Auburn before Attica, and how did the events at Auburn influence in any way the Attica Rebellion?
The riot in Auburn started from them unjustifiably locking people up for virtually no reason at all. So as a result, we wanted to make sure that they was all right and what have you. And the officers wasn't in compliance with our demands at the time, so we kind of took control of the institution. We opened up the cells and let those brothers out. And as a result, that's what happened at Attica. It wasn't severe at Auburn, it wasn't severe as Attica, but it was like a spark, so to say.
Give us a little bit of the personal perspective that you had when the uprising began. Where were you, and what did you do during that period? I was in B block, and what happened was something that stimulated the police's activities was because Jonathan Jackson had got killed in California. His younger brother, Jonathan, tried to break him out, and he tried to say that Jonathan Jackson had a gun, but it was hidden in an afro, so we realized how senseless that was. So it got around, sometimes people go to church services. That's when different people can meet in the church services, so, and that's where they would go. And the consensus was that when we go to foods to eat, no one's not going to say anything and no one's not going to eat. And basically that's what happened. So that created a lot of tension, So as a result, they began locking some brothers up for that. I guess probably for questioning, what have you. And then from that point, once again, they just took control of the units and started opening cells. And when people kind of like breaking loose, it's a control center in Attica. From that center, you could control the opening from cells out into the corridor from each unit. So when they did that, they realized that there was some type of confrontation going on, they closed off all the units, and basically the only unit people was able to get to was the D yard. All other units was closed off. Then, they start taking correctional officers hostages and what have you. And the first day was very confusing. It wasn't really an organized event. It was just something that just spontaneously happened. People started coming up with, grievances. And that was the term that we was going to negotiate was the grievances. And I think after the third day, what happened was one of the correctional officers had died. And that set a whole different tone in the correctional officer's attitude.
While you were experiencing that inside Attica, there were groups on the outside that heard what was going on. And Reverend Scott, why don't you tell our audience where you were and how you responded to the events?
Well, at that time, I was president of an organization called the Fight Organization. And I was president at that time. And if there was anything that happened in the neighborhoods around us, then people would make a beeline to our office and talk about it. And then we would try to help out and see if we could settle that situation. So a couple of, actually about 8 ladies came over to our office, and they had heard about the Attica uprising. We contacted a couple of people who were able to help us get down to Attica. In fact, we drove down right behind the Monroe County Sheriff's Department. So when we talked to them, we explained that we had some people back in Rochester who were loved ones of the inmates. He said, listen, I talked to the commissioner. He wanted to ask you 2 ministers if, in fact, you would be willing to come into D Yard with us and see if we could, just kind of slow this thing down and hopefully bring it to some amiable conclusion. And so we said yes. It was interesting to me because after I got married, I moved to Rochester, but prior to that, I lived in Buffalo. And when I walked through the gauntlet that they had, I started hearing my name called by several guys, some from Buffalo, some from Rochester. Hey, Raymond, hey, Raymond. And actually, it was this interesting feeling for me because I felt secure. When I felt them, I'm walking through this gauntlet and then going down to the head table and sitting there with the people who were the negotiators there. And then they asked us about who we were and how we got there and what was our affiliation with the people on the outside. And the guys in Rochester in particular and Buffalo knew about the Fight Organization, so we got a good welcome there.
Now, Reverend Scott, at this point, how many were part of your group of civilian observers?
It was about 5. That's all.
Only 5. Okay.
At that time, it was one lawyer, I forgot his name, but then it was Arthur E., myself, Marvin Chandler, and then it was the commissioner, Commissioner Oswald. And we sat there and we talked, and actually we introduced ourselves. Each one of us did. That we came in for the first time. And when that happened, we were well received. They had a head table, and the inmates were leaders at the head table.
Okay.
And they sat on one side of the table and we sat on the other. But then one of the guys, I remember, it got to be a bit heated because they felt like Commissioner Oswald had played a game on them, and he didn't live up to one of the commitments that he said he was going to make happen. And so, and this guy that was speaking said, in fact, Commissioner Oswald, we just might not let you out of here. And everybody just kind of looked around, and I got the microphone at that particular point. And I said to the brothers, I said, listen, brothers. I said, we gave our word. We gave this man a commitment for safe passage in and safe passage out. Now, they may not keep their line, they may not keep their word, but we'll keep ours. And some of the brothers started, clapping and and saying right on, that kind of thing. Our presence there for the inmates in particular, I thought, made them feel a sense of security because we would be there to just watch what was going on. And bottom line is we could go out and tell the story.
Yeah.
Of what we were seeing and what we were experiencing.
You were a connection to the outside world for them.
Yes.
So now I'd like to shift things a little bit because we can't really talk about an Attica fight back perspective without bringing in the role of a number of progressive lawyers who played a vital role in that effort. Michael, how did you get involved in the legal fight back on behalf of the Attica inmates?
There was a call put out by the National Lawyers Guild that they asked lawyers to come to Attica, Buffalo and Attica to help with the brothers. And we had a meeting of our office, and we had been in a new office that started in 1969, was a law collective, and we were representing members of the Black Panther Party and Young Lords Party. And we were very active in the movement in Chicago. And we were beginning to do legal prison work as well. And we felt an obligation to go to Attica. And we sent two of the people from our office there. And they were there among the first lawyers that got into the prison. And it's important to note here that lawyers came from New York on the day of the massacre. They had a federal court order to get into prison, signed by the local federal judge, John Curtin, and they refused to let him in. And they called the judge, and he refused to enforce his order. And they didn't get in until the 17th, 4 days later. And already they were beginning a cover-up. In the first days, they were going to be covering up the crimes of the state police. 39 unarmed people were killed on that day. They fired 4,000 rounds of ammunition in 6 minutes. And 10 of their own people were killed, 29 prisoners were killed, and another 100 prisoners were wounded by gunshot. We knew there were going to be indictments, and we knew that we had to prepare for them. And basically, it was a kangaroo grand jury that was going to indict just prisoners. And we were preparing for that, and sure enough, a year later, they indicted 62 prisoners and 42 different indictments with 1,200 felony counts, half of which could end up with life in prison.
Now, when the assault initially took place, the public was told that the inmates had killed the guards who were held hostage. How did you all sort that out so that finally the truth came out?
With the help of the coroner of Monroe County, who did the autopsies on the guards and civilian employees who were killed, and he found each one was killed by bullet wounds. Nobody died as a result of having their throat slit. So that lie was exposed within a few days after the rebellion.
I was a law student at that time, and I heard about the Attica Defense Legal Committee or Attica Defense effort. What was that, and how did it begin to take shape?
So we had a tremendous amount of cases that we had to deal with. And what we did was figure out a way to keep the unity of the brothers. The brothers were very strong, very unified, had a lot of political consciousness, and wanted to stay together. So rather at that point getting individual lawyers for all the 62 prisoners, we kept them all together, and Attica Brothers Legal Defense represented all the prisoners. First thing we did was stop the prosecution from going forward because we inundated them with motions and paper. And the brothers were very clear. They wanted to put the state on trial. They wanted to show that Attica was caused by the conditions and inhumane conditions and that we wanted the real criminals to be indicted. That was a demand that Rockefeller for ordering the massacre, Oswald for denying medical care, and Mancusi for denying medical care, and then the head of the assault force, the guy by the name of John Monahan, we wanted them to be indicted, and of course the state police and the prison guards. It turned out that there were 4 trials, 3 acquittals, the jury in a kidnapping case, so a lot of the brothers were charged with kidnapping for taking the hostages, which had a life sentence. They were acquitted in 2 hours. The first case they brought was a brother by the name of Willie Smith, who was charged with sodomy. They brought a sodomy case as the first case to, kind of disrupt and discredit the brothers, saying and he was acquitted. And then a guy with a gas gun was acquitted as well. And then the main case was the 2 Native American prisoners, young Native American prisoners who shouldn't have even been in Attica, were charged with the murder of Quinn, who was the guard who died in the early moments of the breaking of the Times Square door, and he was trampled. And they had this big trial saying that they had murdered Quinn. And one of them, Johnny Hill Dacajawea, was represented by William Kunstler, and the other one, Charlie Joe Pernasseles, was represented by Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States. And unfortunately, they were convicted. The governor, who was then Hugh Carey, ordered there be an investigation of the investigation, essentially. Did the state police cover up evidence? And it was the whole investigation one-sided. And this investigation by a guy by the name of Meyer, who was a judge, a New York State judge, found that there was a one-sided investigation. And as a result of that, Hugh Carey came forward and said, I'm not going to let these criminal cases go forward. I'm going to give clemency to all the prisoners. And the 2 that were convicted, I'm going to give one who got a life sentence the right to go to parole immediately, and the other one I'm going to let out. So no other prisoners were indicted or charged or convicted as a result of the Attica situation.
Michael, at first glance, that looks like a very humane response from the governor. But what do you think the real reasons were behind that?
The real reason was obvious. They didn't want to charge the state police, or they didn't want to charge the prison guards who went in there with their own guns and shot down people surrendering, lying on the ground. And of course, they didn't want to indict all these guards that were involved in the brutality and the torture, like Big Black was on a table for 4 hours, and all these people were beaten as they ran through a gauntlet. That was a big victory, but it was because they did not want to charge the state police or the prison guards or anybody else. So that's why they dismissed all the cases, so they wouldn't have to indict the state police and the prison guards. 20 years later, we finally got a right to go to trial in the civil case, which had been languishing because the federal judge in Buffalo sat on a motion to dismiss for 4 years. He delayed it all.
Why don't you lay out for the audience exactly what was the civil case and what you were charging the state with?
Okay, the civil case was a class action for all the brothers that were in DER. We said that they were victims of cruel and unusual punishment by an assault that was intended to kill and not to rescue anyone. In addition, they denied the prisoners medical care. People were dying. And in fact, 10 prisoners died from bleeding to death because they didn't have medical care, which is an 8th Amendment violation. And also there was the denial of or allowing, supervising the torture and brutality against Mancusi and against Spale, who was the deputy warden who supervised the rehousing of the prisoners.
In the aftermath of the assault, Reverend Scott, did your civilian observation group play any role at all?
Well, one of the things that we did was work on getting funds together for their defense. And a number of them were able to get out if, in fact, they had the bail money And so we raised money to get them out while they were waiting on the trials. And we kept the whole issue alive. We didn't want anybody to just walk away and forget this. So we kept having rallies and things like that. And as I said, it stayed alive. It really stayed alive.
James Brown, what was your situation after the assault took place? What happened to you?
They had the inmates, walk the yards. They stripped us, had us walk the yard naked with our hands behind our back. And they kept announcing that anyone that's wounded, pull off to this particular exit. I don't quite remember. And there was a brother behind me. He said, "Brother, you know you shot, right?" I said, "Yes, I know." So he said, "Well, they're announcing for you to go to the thing." But a voice inside of me kept telling me, "Don't separate yourself from the masses of people." So later on, after the investigation, a lot of people that went over to that unit, to that exit, wound up coming up dead afterwards.
Wow.
So, and like I said, it was very humiliating. But we used to gun. We had to walk through a gun until we get to the segregation unit. We used to go up spiral stairs, and they had to get beat with sticks on our way through the gauntlet and up the stairs. So it was that, and when they was taking them, they kept saying those things, because back then they had a slogan, "Black is beautiful." And the other officers were saying, "Yeah, black is beautiful, especially when it's bleeding. We got you black MFs now." The look in their eyes, they was foaming at the mouth while they were saying this. I really couldn't believe what I was seeing, but that's what I seen.
Wow. Michael, the story back to you and the evolving civil lawsuit.
Unfortunately, the 6 jurors that were picked originally improperly hung the jury. And they found that medical care was denied, but they didn't hold anyone responsible. They found that they hung on the assault. They hung on the Oswald responsibility. And the only verdict they returned was against the deputy warden who was in charge of the rehousing of the prisoners and saw all the torture and beating. Then, since this was only for liability, we had 2 damage trials, one for the worst person that was damaged, and that was Big Black. And the jury returned a $4 million verdict for him. Then we had a trial of the typical person who was run through the gauntlet and beaten up, but didn't have any permanent injuries. The jury found $75,000 for him. So do the math. If there was 1,000 people who were treated that same way, that's $75 million. That's what they were looking at, plus the $4 million from Big Black. So of course they appealed to the Second Circuit, the United States Court of Appeals, and they took that verdict away from us. They said for some reason we had to prove each individual plaintiff was injured by this failure to supervise, and that the jury verdict forms were confusing, and they said we had to start all over again, basically doing 1,200 individual trials.
Wow. That's incredible.
Yeah, and this is after 20 years of work and all this money, and we didn't have the resources to continue like that. But the one thing they did say is maybe you can settle it. They sent the case to the chief judge, Michael Teleska, and he began settlement hearings. And he had all the brothers come and tell what happened to them. And then at the end of that process, which was now 22 years later, he awarded $8 million to the brothers and $4 million to the lawyers. And he gave, it's piddly stuff. For each prisoner that was killed, he gave him $25,000. And for the brothers that were maimed or tortured, $125,000. And for the person that was just run through the gauntlet, $6,000.
Wow.
So what we could have had if they would have affirmed that verdict was millions of dollars, but they didn't want to give prisoners millions of dollars. And they were all tied to Rockefeller anyway. A lot of those judges were friends of Rockefeller, and they weren't about to give money to prisoners, rebelling prisoners. But Teleska worked it out, and that was the result. And as Big Black said, we didn't go in that yard to get a barrel of money. We went to show the world that we were human and we were entitled to be treated as human beings.
we are commemorating something that happened 50 years ago, but we're also trying to learn from what happened 50 years ago. What do you think some of the lessons are, and how does that inform our communities going forward?
I think as we look at this situation that we had to endure, if we don't remember it, then it's foredoomed to repeat itself. And that's a very dangerous thing.
Back then, you couldn't do anything to an inmate without the different organizations coming together and making sure that that person was not harmed. Like now you may have gangs fighting against each other. Back then we had different organizations. We had the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, the Muslims. We had the Weathermen. But they would come together if anything happened to an inmate, and they would go to the staff and make sure that those people wasn't being harmed or hurt like that today. Seem like inmates is fighting against each other. We fought against the establishment. Today they fight against each other. They're not going to get any meaningful change as long as it remains as that.
Well, at first I would say that the Attica brothers were an extraordinary group of men, very politically conscious, very committed. The experience of working with them and seeing their resilience and their consciousness and their courage made me think, well, if I'm going to work with the Attica brothers, I got to make a commitment like that. And I can't just walk away and say, oh, well, they're there and I'm here. But the reaction to what happened at Attica was that they decided to build high security prisons where they put people in what they called control units. And they took the politically active people, the politically conscious people, and they classified them and put them in these control units and kept them there indefinitely. And that happened all over the country. My understanding and my view is that we have to educate the people outside what's going on in these prisons because they don't know.
On behalf of the organizers of this conference, I want to thank each of you for your participation, your insights, but most of all, I want to thank each of you for your participation in the events of that time. I think that when the audience asks, what does the word solidarity mean? Each of you have demonstrated in your own way of what it means and what it looks like. And as all of you have pointed out, it is solidarity, our commitment to work with one another, to engage and connect with one another, that's going to make things like Attica never happen again. And who knows, maybe the idea that we can radically transform criminal justice in America will be more than just an ideal. So thank you all.
Attica, Attica, what does it mean to stand alone? Attica, Attica, 1,281 souls in the rain and cold. Attica, Attica, another 43 ain't coming home.